Well, today we finally got a balance patch. This is the first round of card changes that we have received since the Heroes of Skyrim expansion has come out, and the balance changes are interesting. I think it's safe to say that there were several people who were waiting for and highly anticipating some sort of balance patch to come around, because I've heard several complaints from both veterans and new players alike that they felt like the meta was getting a little bit stale, and that there was, only a small, handful of decks that were really floating around anymore. So the timing is good. Whether or not they actually accomplished what they were looking to do with these round of changes is yet to be seen. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the card changes. So like always, we start with the card bug fixes, general bug fixes, etc. But all anyone cares about are card changes, right? So we're starting with the nerfs. Right out of the gate, Soul Tear is now a 3-cost card. This one shouldn't really be a shock to anybody. It was the most commonly suggested change in terms of tuning. Might not be the most interesting change, but the safe, slight tweak that a lot of people felt like the card needed. The reason given for the change by Direwolf is as follows. Powerful late game cards like Soul Tear can be very effective in slower matchups, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Normally, cards like this are very costly to play when facing faster decks, but at 2 cost, Soul Tear was feeling a little too free. Interesting they chose the word free instead of not costing enough, because let's be honest, ramp decks are the ones that were abusing Soul Tear more than any other, whether it was Ramp Scout, Ramp Spellsword, Ramp Warrior. Once you ramp to a certain point, it basically does feel free, like the 2 cost is irrelevant. This isn't necessarily a huge nerf. There won't be many times where this card is feeling the weight of this nerf, I guess is what I'll say. That being said, there are a small number of instances where I do expect you to kind of like feel the change, if you will. First and foremost is in what I call the 357 opener, specifically for Ramp Scout. Typically in Ramp, you're hoping when you hit 3 Magicka to play a Ramp card. Ideally in the early game it's Treeminder over Hissgrove, but you want to play a Ramp card, because then the following turn you're going to go to 5 because of your Ramp and play Histmage. Histmage is yet another Ramp card, but it's also got a big body, and against aggressive decks it's certainly great at stalling. And then that ramps you up so that you're at 7 for the following turn, and old Soul Tear meant that if you had one and you were in dire need of, again, another speed bump, you could Soul Tear the Histmage that you had just played and immediately replay it, right? So you were basically going from Histmage to the same Histmage. Obviously, by jumping to a 3 cost, this is no longer the case. You'll have to either have a second Histmage or some other cards to play on that turn. Now, the following turn, when you hit 8, if you're in a desperate need, you can totally then Soul Tear Histmage, but at 8 you're already also potentially playing something like Skeletal Dragon, so it'll be interesting. I think that's the most likely place where you will feel it, is again when you really needed that speed bump against aggressive decks, and you're also trying to ramp. You might also feel a change like this if you're playing the more shout-specific version of Ramp Scout. So there is a version that runs like Word Walls and Alter to find the Greybeards, and then you basically use your leveled up shouts to play very, very large but cheap minions with great effects, right? So decks like that are not... it's not uncommon to see those decks play like Word Wall, for one, that is like, a 4... 4 whatever, 5 whatever, just a massive thing because you got a leveled up Soul Tear. I've seen decks like that obviously abuse Giant Bat. That's another really common one, right? You play Giant Bat early, then you play your leveled up Solitaire, and if you've got a level 3 Solitaire, in the past it was for 5 magic, and now for 6 in one turn you could basically get your like 7/7 charging drain bat. I think that deck is still gonna execute that game plan, just one turn later potentially. So yeah, in my estimation, again, I don't think this is a huge nerf to the card. Decks that were playing this will still play this. It just might slightly hurt their early game and open up some more avenues for aggressive decks to counter Scout and Spellsword and Warrior. Blah, blah, blah. Let's be honest, it was Scout. Alright, so moving on, because we got a fair number of changes to go through. This one is going to make a lot of people happy, but the timing is interesting. So, Supreme Atromancer and the unleveled counterpart Expert Atromancer finally got nerfed. We are over a year later. It's now a 10 cost card. So when I saw this, I immediately on Twitter made the joke that it was a hidden buff because Ultra Assassin now has something worth playing at 10. So in the past, Atro was 9 and Tazcad was 9, and then you had like no 10 drops. I mean, unless you're in Speaker, but Speaker is just terrible, right? So you had no 10 drops, so your Alter would just find nothing if you were on Ultra Assassin. Now, theoretically, it finds Tazcad at 9, Atromancer at 10. But let's be honest, if you've already got your Alter up that high, you've won the game anyway. It was meant to be a cheeky joke. I think this is kind of a big deal. There's a couple of reasons for this, but the big reason for me is that it's going to hurt decks like Merrick because they're delayed even one more turn before they get their combo off. Potentially hurts the mid-range decks that had a intelligence core, and it does so because, again, normally you're playing Atromancer when you're trying to close out a game. Mid-range decks are playing Atromancer to both get the direct damage but also establish a board presence. So being a turn later is just like one more turn for the decks that you would use Atromancer like to counter our online later. Scout, I mean, obviously comes to mind, right? Like if you would play this against Scout, if you had them on their back foot, this was pretty much like the nail in the coffin unless they hit that Odahviing or that Red Brahmin when they needed it. A turn later just gives them one more chance to draw those cards. Control Mage is the one that stands out kind of big for me, right? So in the past, especially if you were like on the Ring, for example, Control Mage had to hold an Ice Storm and or a Dawn's Wrath to deal with the Atromancer play, right? So if you could get a really aggressive start, you could force them into having to use that Ice Storm early, and then if they haven't drawn a second one or drawn the Dawn's Wrath, Atromancer was oftentimes that nail in the coffin against them as well. Being that this comes a turn later, not only do they get the chance to find an answer, but now basically like Manticora is going to be online. So at a minimum, even if they don't have Dawn's Wrath, if they don't have Ice Storm, they can still nuke the Atromancer and put the 6/6 in front of the 5/3, which will greatly mitigate the impact of that play. So I think this moving to 10 is kind of a big deal. I'm not saying that this card's going to disappear. I think that the stats and the effect are still very, very strong. I think people will probably ditch it for a bit, but that it might circle its way back around at some point because, again, it's the kind of card that still has an immediate board impact, but this does hurt it for sure, make no mistake. So let's move on. Shield Breaker. Whoops, might have got a preview of the one below it, but Shield Breaker. This is now a 3-cost card from 2 to 3. We're noticing a trend in the nerfs. This one is interesting and it feels a little bit personal. So as the person who kind of proliferated Time to Fight as a deck style, the reasoning for the nerf to Shieldbreaker is, and I quote, "Shieldbreaker pushes a very uninteractive, aggressive deck that tries to attack its opponent at every opportunity. Pushing it to 3 cost will encourage players to play more interactive, aggressive decks." First of all, yes, Time to Fight is not very interactive. You can make trades, but the whole point is to be as uninteractive as possible. You're trying to interact with their face. Shieldbreaker definitely helped with that. So, I mean, they're not wrong, but it just says that it's kind of funny that it pushes a very uninteractive deck that tries to attack its opponent at every opportunity. I mean, every aggressive deck wants to do that if given the opportunity, so that's kind of interesting. But the second line I also thought was interesting because it says pushing it to a 3 cost will encourage players to play more interactive aggressive decks. This is funny to me for 2 reasons. One, it doesn't say a more interactive playstyle with that deck, and I'm not even talking about Time to Fight, but just like whatever deck you were playing Shieldbreaker, it says more interactive aggressive decks. It's almost like it's saying, we want you to play something else. 2, it's interesting to me because, again, if you're saying interactive and aggressive, I'm not saying that those 2 things can't be a thing. I think Tokens is a great example. Tokens can be very aggressive but also interactive because you can use your expendable bodies to kind of keep control of the board. But for the most part, in the past, aggressive is usually not interactive. Like, you're trying to interact with your opponent's face, right? You're not there to trade all day. That's what mid-range is for. So, yeah. I'm not surprised by the nerf. Before, right, I always felt like this card was overstated for the cost anyway. Usually with items, they kind of take a hit in terms of their stat value because they have what I call pseudo charge. So if you play an item on a creature, you get the benefit of the stats right away. So it doesn't have charge by itself, but as long as you have a creature, you can make use of the stats immediately, so it's kind of like charge. A 2/2 for 2, you know, if you had a 2/2 charge creature for 2, like, I would play that all day long, right? So a 2/2 for 2 that also let you go right through somebody's defenses seemed pretty good. Even more so, this doesn't even say an enemy creature loses guard in this lane. Originally, when I was thinking about this card, and if it were ever to get a nerf, I always thought that was going to be the way they would word it, right? An enemy creature in this lane loses guard for a couple of reasons. One, it's Shieldbreaker, right? Like, you're breaking through somebody's shield. It should be in the lane because you're bursting through. I mean, that just made sense to me from a flavor standpoint. But 2, it also meant that whatever creature you were putting the item on, to get that benefit of breaking through the guard, you had to put that creature in danger, right? There had to be something else already in the lane that even if you go through the guard, they can turn around and contest it. Shieldbreaker right now, as it stands, was really versatile because if they had a guard in the field lane, you play your charge in the shadow lane, and then you throw this on it just for free damage. You could still pull the guard off the creature in the field lane and set up future plays there, right? Like, it wasn't even that you were pushing your damage that turn, you were just opening avenues for future turns. So, that being said, I think moving it to a 3 cost isn't necessarily a death sentence, but it means it's not a auto-include you must run 3 of, in all likelihood. Yeah, again, I would have liked to have seen this maybe be in, you know, enemy creature loses guard in this lane, but overall, I'm not shocked, I'm going to be honest. Moving on, this is the interesting one. Imprison and then its unleveled counterpart Detain both go from 1 cost to 2 cost. The reasoning given was, at 1 cost, Imprison was proving too efficient a removal spell in heavy willpower decks. Imprison will still feel very powerful when you play it with 4 creatures out, but the risks attached to it are a little bigger at 2 cost. This nerf makes sense. A 1 cost hard removal of any creature on the board, even if it does have a a condition like that tied to it seems really strong, right? It would probably be less strong if Imperial Reinforcements wasn't a card, but with it at 1 cost, for the same cost as Piercing Javelin, you could flood a lane and nuke something. Now granted, that's a 2 cards as opposed to 1 card investment, but when you're talking about like tempo, I think you can quickly see and easily see why Imprison felt really, really strong, even if you had an empty board, right? Like you could reinforcements and then blow something up. So now you're going to have to work just a hair harder to pull off those combos. I think Imprison still sees play in the decks that was already playing it, because you're not going to say dump this now for Piercing Javelin. You still, the whole reason Imprison gets played over Javelin now, or even Edict of Azura, is that you want to be able to continue to play bodies and pull threats off the board. Going from 1 cost to 2 cost doesn't change your ability to do so. Might change like how soon or how frequently, or how many creatures you play in that turn, but you're still able to play this card and very effectively play other cards from hand. So again, kind of a surprise that this one was nerfed in particular. I felt like tokens were probably going to get a nerf, and I was talking on Twitter before we saw these card changes, and I was saying that the thing about the token package was there wasn't necessarily anything that overall felt really broken as a whole as part of the package, but it was very clear that tokens were doing well prior to this patch, so they needed some sort of adjustment. So I'm not shocked that we got one. I'm not even shocked that this is it. It's just, it was hard to predict because there was nothing inherently glaring about the token package before when you looked at it. Like, you never looked at anything and said like, this is too strong, this is the swingy play. I guess of them, this is probably the closest thing to that, but yeah, kind of a surprise, but not. So, the last one, and this one's probably like a big one, at least in my opinion. Thief of Dreams is now a 4/4. It goes from a 5/5 to a 4/4. Here is the reasoning given. Intelligence creatures that have powerful abilities usually sacrifice some stat points. At 5 cost, 5/5, it did not feel like you were paying much for Thief of Dreams' ability. By moving Thief's stats down to 4/4, it makes its stats line up more with other intelligence creatures. Oh boy. I mean, they're not wrong when you compare it to other intelligence creatures, right? Hexmage is a 4/4 for 5 that has a very strong ability. Elusive Schemer is obviously understated for its strong ability, including its draw card. The ward creatures are understated because of the fact that they have ward. So, I mean, there is precedent. But I don't think that the Thief of Dreams ability is that strong to warrant 2 stat points of loss. Me personally, right? Just because of what this card did for some decks, I really feel like maybe moving this to a 5/4 might have been enough. That way it at least dies to Lightning Bolt, and it at least dies to many of the other 4/4 bodies that are out there. Like, there's a pretty big difference between 4 health and 5 health in this game. 4 health means that Mammoth trades and your Necromancers and Royal Sages and Mystic Dragons and all of those things can trade and kill it. The minute you go to 5 health, you're out of Lightning Bolt range, you're protected by those trades without some help. 5 health is a big deal. So, moving this to a 5/4, I think I would have been okay with. Obviously, they've probably done some internal testing and felt like this is fine, but the reason the 5 attack is really important, in my opinion, is because that was the way you dealt with Hissmage if you had a very strong blue core set of creatures, right? Thief of Dreams was the card that you could play, trade into your opponent's Hissmage, and it would, win that battle and survive, and then allow you you know, continue to develop your board, right? Like the way you beat Scout is by snowballing your board state while they make their very inefficient plays to ramp up their Magicka, and you're hoping to get to a point where your board is just insurmountable. By moving this to a 4/4, this doesn't directly trade with Histmage anymore, in that it doesn't like trade and survive. Now it takes 2 turns to trade into it, and it doesn't even survive the outcome, right? Like, that's a pretty big deal for this card. It, you know, it doesn't, I don't know, it just doesn't excite me anymore. There are so many, in my opinion, better 5-cost 4/4s, things like Shadowfen Priest, that I'm not saying this card won't see play, but I don't see it being played with nearly the frequency that it was before. This is a pretty big nerf to this card. So, yeah. And now some buffs. We've been all through the nerfs. 3 cards got buffs, though. First, Brynjolf went from a 4/4 to a 4/5. This is actually really exciting. For those of you who are new, you may not know that Reeve, Blademaster, used to be a 2/5 for 4, and he almost was never played. Like, he was not included in aggressive decks, mid-range decks, because he died to execute, and he died to so many things that were targeting that 2 or less attack. So when he got bumped up to a 3/5, he went from never seeing play to almost being like auto-include in anything that was running strength and mid-range, because his effect was always good, he was just too brittle, right? I think that you're looking at something very similar here with Brynjolf. Brynjolf did not see play because he was a 5-cost 4/4 that died to Lightning Bolt, right? The last thing you want to do is play a creature and then have your opponent kill it for a less you know, Magicka investment, or kill it for free with a Prophecy. Just as I was saying before, when I was talking about Thief of Dreams, there is a big difference between 4 health and 5 health. So I think this helps Brynjolf. I think that it will, you know, building around him is going to be hard because Pilfer is still like a kind of weakish build around mechanic. It's more combo oriented with the whole Master of Thieves combo. Focusing heavily on Drain isn't typically something you want to do. Usually you use Drain semi-sparingly in like a control environment or a control deck, so that you can take some damage to draw some cards and then Drain back up, but you're never going to be like, I want to build the full-on Drain deck. So, you know, in their explanation for all of these buffs, they were talking about buffing a few build-around cards. I'm not sure that Brynjolf will still be used in that capacity, but he will see more play. I think he's a fantastic option to potentially include now in things like Control Monk. You know, I've played Control Assassin before, and I was relying heavily on like Werebet in Queen Baronzia because there was not a lot of life gain options. This absolutely I would throw into that archetype. Even Ramp Scout might be willing to run him just because he's not a Hist Mage, but if you don't have a Hist Mage on 5, he's a good enough body against aggro. He's likely going to trade into something and gain you 4 health, and then they're going to have to spend another resource or another creature to kill him. Again, like, big difference between 4 health and 5 health. I really like the change to Brynjolf. Cliffside Lookout goes from a 2/4 to a 2/5. Probably not enough to really help it out in Constructed because there weren't a ton of Dragon willpower decks floating. There were some, right? I'm not going to say they didn't exist, but not a ton. And there are, you know, if you're playing those kind of decks or those slowish decks, if you will, I think there are better 3-drops just kind of around the board. But I think this is going to have a pretty big impact in Arena. The sneaky combo now is that this interacts very, very nicely with East Empire Crafter. And if you're drafting Spellsword, you're likely going to be offered a handful of Lookouts and a handful of East Empire Crafters. And they work very, very well together now. The East Empire, once it sticks on the board, if it survives for a turn, suddenly all of your Lookouts are becoming 3/6 guards, right? You're getting discount Hive Defenders. So I think that that's where you're going to see the impact more. It's probably an arena with this card because the extra stat point helps a lot. Maybe constructed. I don't know, but definitely you'll notice it in arena. Young Dragonborn goes from a 3-2 to a 3-3. Doesn't seem like a huge deal on the surface because even at a 3-3 body, you're like, well, what dragons does it even trade into, right? Surprisingly, it has the potential to now get you value. Now, this is a very niche scenario, but the 1 health matters because it can get you value if you run Drain Vitality and you're going up against Mystic Dragons or Serpentine Stalkers, right? So the 4/4 dragons now die to Dragonborn, and you get your free shout out of it with 1 Drain Vitality. So you play the Dragonborn, then the following turn you play Drain Vitality. Opponent's dragon goes down to a 3/3. Dragonborn, because you've played a shout, goes to a 4/4. Trades in and survives, and you get a random shout. Is that enough to make it constructed viable? Probably not, right? Let's be honest. But again, look out for that interaction in arena, specifically like with Mystic Dragons. And worst case scenario, to be honest, if you are given some pretty poor choices in arena, a 3/3 for 3 sometimes is just good enough. So before you felt extra bad because you had a 3/2 for 3, which were subpar stats, and you likely never got any uses out of his ability. A 3/3 for 3 now is good enough with some upside. So yeah, that's it. That is the card changes. Fair amount of nerfs, small number of buffs. What's interesting to me, right, is that Scout kind of got a slap on the wrist. Whoops. Soul Tear has the potential to matter, but I don't think it'll matter a lot. Similarly, I think Tokens got a slap on the wrist. This has the potential to matter, but won't matter a lot. Much like the Soul Tear nerf, it's only going to be those weird, like, niche scenarios where you're trying to play a combination of cards, and in the past you used to be able to, and now you can't. That'll feel bad for, you know, maybe the first week, and then you'll hardly even notice it, right? Like, legitimately, I would be willing to load up my Token Crusader list right now and go play it and not change a thing. I think this doesn't impact anything. Same thing with Scout for me, right? You know, if you have a Scout list and you want to load it up post patch, feel free. I don't think that that is enough. Mid-range decks probably, you know, when I say mid-range decks, I really mean the intelligence-based mid-range ones. Probably will do some tinkering. I think Sorcerer probably just drops Atromancer altogether and goes with Bone Colossus in its place. Shows up sooner, floods the board, still a great option against all of the decks that you would typically want to run this against anyway. Assassin, I'm probably going to try a version of Assassin that's just a little bit speedier, right? A little bit more low-end curve, less this. I think the Assassin will still have plenty of viable builds. Yeah, this really hurts Merrick, in my opinion. So that's kind of it. This is interesting. I think Time to Fight's still viable. I just don't think Shieldbreaker is necessarily an auto-include 3 of. I'd probably have to test it. You probably still run at least 2 of them, but whether you run the full complement of 3, yet to be seen. Thief of Dreams got a hammer. Yeah. So, other things I'm planning on testing tonight are the things that were untouched. So, this is my bit of speculation, right? So it's interesting. I kind of talked about this at the beginning of the video, but we got a round of changes, and the truth is, I don't think that it changed much. The Imprison change, in my opinion, doesn't do much to deter tokens. I don't think the Soul Tear change does much to deter Scout. I don't think either of those things are enough to help Control Mage, you know, win more against tokens, because it was already winning more. I don't think it makes it lose less to Scout, because it was already losing a fair number of those matchups. You might go from winning, 2 out of every 10 to 3 out of every 10, but it's still going to be a really bad matchup, in my opinion. Same thing, right? Like, you might be tokens one more time now than you used to in the past as Control Mage. But as far as, like, the Control Mage to tokens to Scout, like, Circle, I think that's entirely intact. I think there will be some new decks that kind of pop up in the meta as well. One of them was growing in frequency before, and I fully expect it to grow even more now because it was not touched at all by these changes, is Goblins. Matt Oblivion took Goblins to number 1 for a bit. It is a very aggressive deck, and it was, good before. It is still good now. It was not touched by changes, so I'm eager to test it tonight while everyone else is kind of trying to figure out new things. But yeah, I think your meta is going to be the same. I know that's not what a lot of people wanted to hear, but I think you're still going to see tokens. You're probably interspersed still going to see a small number of mid-range decks, likely Sorcerer and Assassin, which were the 2 most frequently that I saw anyway. You're still going to see Scout. It's not going anywhere. You're still going to run into the random Control Mage. And Goblins, right? Like, I think these changes are all fine. I just don't think that it's going to do a lot to change the ladder experience. I think that this actually, it's funny, I think some of these changes have a greater impact on tournaments than necessarily the ladder, just because of the nature of what decks counteract other decks. But just general, like, you jump on and play games and grind, I think your ladder experience is ultimately going to end up being the same. No, that's not what people want to hear, but that's my opinion. As always, I want to hear yours. Let me know in the comments and whatever. Do you like the changes? Do you not? Is there a deck you want to try out now? Is there a variant of an existing deck that you're going to try now that there's changes? Do you think I'm wrong about my meta prediction, right? Do you see something else rising to the top? Do you think that any of these previous meta decks are going to fall out entirely? Let me know, right? I love a good discussion. So, as always, thanks for watching, and until next time, may you walk on warm sands.